Okay, let's get to this last video now of the Unit 8, the endocrine system. And I talked about last day, the last video, we were just finishing up different glands in the endocrine system. We talked about the pineal gland, and then we're going to move on to not any more glands especially, but I want to point out that there are other tissues in the body that can produce hormones. They're not full-on endocrine glands, but they do have that function. So we can look through down here through the list, and these tissues will produce hormones and they'll produce chemical messengers, but it'll have a localized effect. That means it's going to be, the hormone will be produced and it'll have an effect very close to where it's produced. So if we look at the stomach, for example, it'll produce a hormone called gastrin, and that's going to regulate the secretion of gastric acid. So it's going to have an effect directly in the stomach. The hormone's produced in the stomach, and it has an effect on the way the stomach behaves. It's the same thing for the small intestine. It secretes a hormone called secretin, and that's going to regulate the environment of the small intestine, the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. So it'll have a look at, or it'll help control the pH, and that's a very important thing locally. I'm not going to expect you guys to know these hormones, but what I want you to be aware of is the fact that there are other tissues in the body that can secrete hormones, or they have a hormone function, but we don't necessarily classify them as an endocrine gland. So the stomach, the small intestine, like we talked about, the kidneys, the liver, the atria of the heart can actually do this as well. On top of that, the adipose tissue and the placenta. These are all tissues that can have some type of endocrine function, but we don't fully classify them as endocrine glands. Now, this next slide is a pretty good slide for you guys to have a look at, to study. What it does is it points out where on the body we can find these endocrine glands, and it also lists what hormones are produced there. So this is a pretty good summary slide, along with the hormone review table that we put on the unit. I think this is a pretty good review for most of the parts of this unit. Okay, so the last part of all of our units, of course, are going to be disorders. So what can happen if our endocrine system breaks down, or it doesn't do what it's supposed to do? And there's a lot of diseases and conditions that can result of a poor functioning endocrine system. Hormones control a lot of our metabolic day-to-day functions. So if those things don't work, then we are going to see symptoms and conditions develop in the body. Now, these are generally caused by either an overproduction of a hormone, which is called hypersecretion, or an underproduction of a hormone, which is called hyposecretion. So make sure you don't get those terms confused. Hypersecretion means extra hormone is produced. Hyposecretion means that we don't have enough hormone produced. And a really good example of that is growth hormone, and we'll come back to that in just a couple of seconds. First, let's have a quick look at the pancreatic diseases. Now, most people are familiar with diabetes. What most people don't realize is there's different forms of diabetes. You can have type 1, type 2, and gestational diabetes. These are all different. They're caused by different things, but they have a similar outcome. Now, the first one, type 1 diabetes, this is not as common as type 2, but it is more severe. This is caused by an autoimmune condition where the body attacks the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans, and as a result, we don't produce enough insulin. So blood glucose gets quite high. It's not stored away, and that can be a very problematic thing. Type 2 diabetes is the most common one. It's not insulin. It's non-insulin dependent diabetes. It's caused by most often by a poor functioning pancreas as we get older. So we see this quite commonly in older folks. But it can also be caused by people who are obese. So this is one that we'd see in the general population where we have a more sedentary lifestyle. People aren't quite as active. This can be controlled by diet or exercise. So you can be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. If you make changes in your lifestyle, your diet, how much you exercise, you get yourself fit and healthy, then this condition will go away. And then thirdly, we have gestational diabetes. This will usually disappear after childbirth. So this is the type of diabetes that mothers would get when they're, or expecting mothers would get when they're pregnant with a child. Gestation refers to child development inside the mother. So after childbirth, this will usually disappear for the mother. It won't be an issue anymore, but it can be quite serious while the child is still in development. It usually happens to mothers who are overweight, or if they have a family history of diabetes. That can have an effect on if the mother contracts that or not. Okay, if we get back to the pituitary gland and growth hormone, this is a good example of what can happen when growth hormone is either present or absent at different times in the life. Okay, so if we get a hyposecretion of growth hormone, and don't forget, growth hormone is produced by the pituitary gland. So if growth hormone isn't present enough, what we'll end up with is a condition called dwarfism, and that's where people have shortened limbs, they're shortened in height, and they generally appear smaller than a normal person would. Now, if we have hypersecretion, so we have extra growth hormone, then we can get two different conditions as a result of that. If the hypersecretion happens during childhood, so before the person that has their bones fused together and their skeleton completely fully grown, then the skeleton and the muscles will continue to grow, and we'll end up with a condition called gigantism. So this is where we see extremely tall individuals, much taller than the average person. Now, if the hypersecretion of the hormone occurs in adulthood, where the skeleton is already fully formed and the growth height has stopped, what will happen is the bones will start to widen. As a result of that, you'll see much wider features, especially in the face. And if you look at the pictures here, you see a young lady who's developed acromegaly. And you can see her as she progresses, she gets older. You can see her face and her nose and her jaw especially has gotten wider in shape. And that's a condition called acromegaly, when we have excessive growth hormone present in adulthood. We can also look at the hypo and hyperfunctioning of the adrenal glands. So we spoke about this when we talked about the adrenal glands, what can happen, and this is just further example of that. A hyposecretion of the adrenal glands and the cortex will give us low cortisol or aldosterone, and that'll result in extreme fatigue, weight loss, the darkening of the skin, low blood pressure, low blood sugar, just a general lack of energy. And this is going to be Addison's disease. We spoke about that in a previous video, and I've mentioned it in class as well. If we get hypersecretion, and this is when we end up with extra cortisol in our blood, then we develop Cushing's disease. And Cushing's disease is quite often characterized by a person having a buildup of fat on the back of their neck, right here. So a fat pad will build up right there, and it's indicative of Cushing's disease. We also get rounding of the face and very easily bruising of the skin. Now, Cushing's disease is quite often caused by a tumor or excessive growth that's developed in the pituitary gland, and that causes hypersecretion of ACTH, which causes hypersecretion of cortisol in the adrenal cortex. Another common condition that we can have is conditions hypofunction or hyperfunction of the thyroid. Now remember, the thyroid secretes T3 and T4, which are going to have conditions or going to have ramifications on our metabolism. So we can get a condition called Graves' disease when we have hyperthyroidism. So we get overproduction of T3 and T4. That'll cause an increase in metabolic rate. It'll cause an increase in our body temperature and blood pressure. You'll see weight loss, hyperactivity, so somebody can't sit still, they can't relax or rest, and it generally makes people irritable. One thing that can happen in the thyroid is that it will store its hormones. So if we have an overproduction of T3 and T4, the gland will actually store those hormones, and what will happen is the gland will become quite enlarged, as we can see in the picture there. And when we see an enlarged thyroid gland, we call that goiter. And the lady in that picture there has a large goiter on her neck because her thyroid gland is expanded. Now, the opposite is when we have the underproduction of T3 and T4, and that's a condition called hypothyroidism or myxedema. We're going to see the absolute opposite in conditions, symptoms. You'll have a lower metabolic rate. You will be lethargic, low energy, be quite sensitive to cold, puffy face, dry skin. So these are all symptoms of not having enough T3 and T4, and as a result, we'll have a lower overall metabolism. Now, we've also grown and discovered that we can use hormones as a treatment. So for certain conditions, we can prescribe hormones, and that can help treat some of these conditions, especially if we have an underperforming gland or we have a hyposecretion situation. So we will extract hormones from animal tissue, usually, or we can manufacture them in a lab, which is our better way to go. We can genetically engineer them so that they're even better than our normal ones. And then depending on the condition, we can give those to patients as a treatment. So if we look down through here, we've found ways to use growth hormone, insulin, adrenal steroids, epinephrine or adrenaline, thyroid hormones, oxytocin, androgens, estrogens, and progesterone. We've used all of those in medical treatments to help people with certain conditions. So if you go through that table, you'll be able to see how we use those hormones to treat certain conditions in patients, generally when they don't have enough hormone being produced. But in case of estrogen and progesterone, for example, we can use that for people who have trouble getting pregnant. We can use that in vitro fertilization, IVF, so we can help people who otherwise wouldn't be able to have children. So if we have a look at stress and the endocrine system, so the endocrine system controls some of the hormones that control stress. So it stands to reason that if the endocrine system is constantly under stress, then there's going to be something that can happen. And generally, what happens, we end up with a condition called the General Adaptation Syndrome, GAS. And stress is controlled by the hypothalamus, and this will occur in 3 stages. Okay, this is a stress response. First, we get that initial fight or flight response, and that's going to be initiated by the sympathetic nervous system. And that's going to be for us to deal with the stressor very quickly. So that's our initial response. The second part is going to be a resistance reaction. So a couple of hormones will be released by the hypothalamus, and that'll help us deal with the stress after the fight or flight response. Now, this resistance reaction will take a much longer time. So fight or flight is in the order of seconds, minutes, but this resistance will go for hours, perhaps. And then the third is exhaustion. So the body has used up whatever resources it has to deal with the stressor. It's used up the hormones, it's used up the fight or flight response, and it becomes exhausted. And we get into a general state of lethargism, and so on. So low energy and just general exhaustion. Now, if we stay in these situations for long periods of time, it can lead us to serious health concerns. So that's why stress, an overabundance of stress, is never a good thing. Some of the things that can happen is you'll see a loss of muscle tone, and you'll also see gastrointestinal ulcers form as a result of high stress situations for extended periods of time. And then, of course, we'll always talk about how a reticular system reacts to aging, and there's no difference for the endocrine system. One of the things that may happen to our endocrine glands is they may shrink. When that happens, we'll see a general deficiency. So we'll get a hyposecretion situation where we don't have as much hormone as we normally would. So in a couple of different hormones, we'll look at that. If we start to see a decrease in growth hormone from the anterior pituitary, then we'll see, muscle atrophy. We'll start to lose muscle, which we generally see when we get older. The pancreas will release insulin either slowly or not as much quantity, and that's why we see adult onset diabetes mellitus. Thyroid hormone starts to decrease, so we see a decrease in metabolism. That generally is going to lead to increased body fat or hypothyroidism, and that's generally something we see as adults. And then finally, the parathyroid hormone starts to rise, and then we see calcium is not available for bones anymore. and as a result of that, we'll see loss of bone mass. So there's lots of things that can happen as we age.